One of the things you should know about us is that we've been in a conversation for several weeks about the care and feeding of the human soul. And we're taking quite a few weeks to talk about this because it's a pretty important topic. And we spend a lot of our time talking about caring for other parts of ourselves. We spend a lot of time and energy talking about caring for our bodies, as we should, and maybe caring for our minds, caring for our emotions even. But we often don't talk enough about caring for the most important part of you, the most valuable part of you, the most eternal part of you, and that is your soul. So week by week, we're taking a look at the human soul. What is it? What's wrong with it? What does it need? And so we're going to continue that today. And I want to start by telling you a story about a man who lived in a town where his house was in pretty close proximity to his office, and so every day he would walk to work. And as he's walking through the neighborhood, one day he noticed that one of his neighbors had bought a house. They bought this house and they began to fix it up, and they began to build a garden in the front yard of this house. And as the garden was developing, it started to bloom, and it was beautiful. And every day this guy would get up walking to work, he found himself anticipating seeing the garden. He was so excited every day to see the garden, and it was masterful. It just started his day off right. He was so fascinated with this garden. So day by day, week by week, month by month, this guy looked forward to seeing the garden. And then one day he noticed something. As he was walking by the garden, a thought came to him. He thought to himself, why is it that my neighbor can have a garden like that and I don't have a garden like that? And he started thinking about all the reasons he didn't have a garden like that. Well, first of all, his front yard wasn't configured the right way, the way his house was. And second of all, he didn't have time to plant and tend to a garden like that. That guy was retired, and he wasn't retired. He didn't have the knowledge or the know-how to do it anyway. He didn't have the money to do it. And so day by day, as he was going by, he was excited to see the garden at first. But as this thought began to fester in his mind, he found himself not as excited about the garden anymore. In fact, he started feeling a little low level of resentment against his neighbor, and he began to resent seeing the garden because it reminded him of all the things he didn't have, until the point that he actually began to walk a different way to work because he wanted to avoid the garden and how it made him feel. Now, why do humans have such a difficult time admiring something without having to acquire it? Have you ever noticed that? It's true about yourself. It's true about me. Like, you have a difficult time admiring something and recognizing its value and its beauty and its worth without needing this sense to feel that it's mine, that I own it, it belongs to me. But the problem is even worse than that. Because if you're ever able to acquire that thing that you admire, pretty soon, if you've noticed it, your admiration for the thing that you own begins to diminish. It just becomes something you own, something you have. And you start wanting more of that thing or something better than that thing. You know, a new car, a new house, a new spouse, right? I mean, you go through your life and you just have this desire, you admire something, and then there's a desire to acquire that something, and then as you acquire that thing, it kind of fades into the background and new desires come in and take its place, and there's always something more. There's something inside of us that longs for more. Why does it seem that the more we consume something, the more we want of it? You notice that? Like, you get something and you think, if I get just a little bit, it will be enough, but that little bit's never enough. You always need more of that thing, and more and more and more, and then the thing consumes you, and before you know it, that thing is actually controlling your life. What is it about us that is that way? What leads to that? Well, there's an interesting play of words in the Old Testament. So we've been talking about the human soul for several weeks, and the Hebrew word for soul is nephesh. And nephesh can also be translated as mouth, throat, or stomach. Now think about that for a second, because when I first saw that, I'm like, what? That seems like completely opposite things, your soul and your mouth and your throat and your stomach. But actually, I think what that word is telling us is there's something about our souls that are very much like our mouths, our throats, and our stomachs. They have a need to be filled, right? You are going to leave here, and at some point today, you are probably going to put something in your mouth, your throat, and in your stomach, because it is constantly needing so. It doesn't matter that you just fed your mouth, your throat, and your stomach yesterday. That's not good enough. You've got to feed it again today. And my guess is you'll feed it more than one time today. You will feed it and keep feeding it. And sometimes, come on, the more you feed it, the more you have to feed it, right? Right? This is just the nature, not just of our bodies, but it's also the nature of our human soul. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. Because your soul needs satisfaction. And according to the Rolling Stones, you can't get none. Right? You know you can't get any. Because you've been trying. You've been looking for it. You've looked for it in beauty, you've looked for it in power, you've looked for it in a new job, you've looked for it in more money, you've looked for it in all kinds of things, and you get the thing you think will satisfy you, and it only takes a little bit of time till you find out that that thing isn't satisfying you anymore. Your soul needs satisfaction. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis. I've used it before, you probably heard it before, but it's so true. He says this: if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. Your soul was made for another world. That's why it doesn't matter how much you get or how much recognition you have, how much money you have, how much power or authority. It doesn't matter how much you get. Your soul always needs something more because your soul wasn't made to be satisfied by anything in this world. Every hunger you have, every longing you experience, every lust, every desire point beyond themselves to something even greater. Let me give you an example. You have never eaten a meal so good that you said, I'll never eat again. You haven't. In fact, after you ate that great meal, you were even hungrier than you would have been had you not eaten that great meal. That's why after you eat Thanksgiving and you say you're stuffed, what happens in 2 or 3 hours? You're starving to death. Why? Because the more you feed it, the more you need to feed it. You have never seen something so beautiful that you've thought, I never need to see anything beautiful again. Like you see something beautiful and you instinctively know you want to see something that's more beautiful. It only feeds your hunger for something beautiful. So what is it that will satisfy this craving that is inside of us that seems to find no satisfaction? St. Augustine said it this way: you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. You know what Augustine is saying? He's saying the same thing C.S. Lewis is saying. And that is, those desires and longings that you have are pointing beyond the thing you think you're desiring to the eternal, to the only thing that will ultimately bring satisfaction and rest to your restless soul, and that is God. That until our hearts, until our souls are resting in God, they will be restless. And here's what happens when our souls are restless. When our souls are seeking satisfaction in anything else, they become monsters. They become monsters that wreak all kind of havoc in our lives and the lives of the people around us, and we end up feeding a bottomless pit that will never be satisfied by more money, more power, more riches, more recognition, more fame, more beauty, more sex, more anything. It will never be filled. The only thing that is ultimately and finally going to satisfy your soul is a relationship with your soul's maker through Jesus Christ. Now, as I began to put this series together, and this message in particular, I thought about several Bible stories that could really illustrate this for us. And one of them is the story of Jacob and Esau. And if you were in small groups today, your small group talked about that. If you're not in a small group, we put a small group discussion guide in here every week you can use with your family. But there are lots of stories that talk about what happens when our soul isn't satisfied in God. And I wanted to instead share with you during the message today a very famous story about the fall of Israel's most famous king, and that is King David. So if you have a Bible, look with me at 2 Samuel chapter 11, because this is a great picture of what happens when our souls are not satisfied in God, and the dangers and the disaster that come about as a result of it. So 2 Samuel chapter 11, in verse 1, it starts this way. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So already we know we have a problem, that there is a pattern of things that are expected to happen among kings, and that is in the spring, kings go off to war. David should be going off to war, but David doesn't do the thing he's supposed to do. Now, why doesn't he do it? We don't know. Was he restless? Was he tired of war? He'd been in a lot of battles. Was he just tired of all the bloodshed? Was he physically tired? Was he emotionally tired? Did he have something better to do? Why didn't David go with Joab? Why did he send Joab and the army out? They were victorious without him, but David didn't go with him. So what happened while David was staying behind? Well, verse 2 tells us. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And this is one of the servants that he sent to figure out, hey, who is this beautiful woman? And the one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now, it's interesting that this messenger who goes out from David comes back and he doesn't just give him a definitive answer. He doesn't just say, oh yeah, that's Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. He doesn't just answer the question. Instead, he poses the answer as a question itself. Why? Because this messenger knew something that maybe you don't know, but David certainly did know. Uriah wasn't just any other person living in Jerusalem. Uriah was one of David's 30 main guys. Before David became king, when David was still running from Saul, he had assembled this group of people, these allies. They were with David through thick and thin. They were with him through the hard times. And Uriah was one of those guys. This wasn't some stranger. This wasn't some enemy. This was one of David's closest, most trusted associates. And this guy, this messenger comes back and says, David, I'm not sure if you're looking where you're not supposed to be looking. Maybe you should not be looking because isn't that Bathsheba? Isn't that Uriah's wife? In other words, David, stop it, right? I mean, you can't tell the king to stop it, but this guy is basically saying, David, what are you doing? What are you thinking about? Now, you think that might be enough to be a warning to turn David away, but it's not. Look what happens in verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her. He took her. Something that wasn't his, that belonged to one of his most trusted and long-term friends. He took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now, she had been purifying herself from her uncleanliness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived and sent and told David, I am pregnant. Uh-oh. Houston, we have a problem. David is now in trouble. Because his restlessness, his longing and his desire that he didn't know how to satisfy with anything else, he just decided he's going to try to satisfy it with more. Now, David already had a lot of wives. He had the whole kingdom at his fingertips. And he's looking out and he sees this woman who is not his wife, who is the wife of one of his close friends, and he takes her, and now she is pregnant, and David has a problem. But David is also a smart man, so he has a solution. So he calls Uriah back from the battlefield. And he calls him back under the guise of saying, hey, I need a messenger to come and give me an update. Since I'm not where I'm supposed to be, fighting this war with the rest of you guys, send Uriah back to give me an update on the battle. So Uriah comes back. Uriah gives him the update. And David's like, okay, now that I got you here, he's going to go home, be with his family, rest, be with his wife. And then, when she turns up to be pregnant, it's obviously his, and no harm, no foul. I get out of this. Except that Uriah had more integrity than David did. Because David, who was supposed to be with the men in the battle, wouldn't go and instead was at home in the comfort of his own home. But Uriah said, I am not going to go and be comfortable in my own home when all my guys are out in the front line battling. So he slept on the porch of the palace. So David gets up the next day and he goes out. And there's Uriah sleeping on the porch. And he's like, man, this is a problem. I got to get this guy to go home. Man, my whole kingdom could line on it. My family could line on it. I've got to get this guy to go home. I've got to get him to go home. So he has the second plan. He says, okay, I'll get him drunk. So he brings him in, has a great feast, gives him a lot of wine, gets him drunk, and says, okay, go home. But the guy, even when he's drunk, he doesn't go home. He sleeps on the front steps. So David's like, okay, I didn't want to do this, but instead now I'm going to write a message. And he writes a message to Joab, and he tells Joab, the commander of the army, he says, hey, listen, when Uriah comes back, I need you to put him on the front line. And when the battle gets fierce, I need everybody to pull back from Uriah, meaning that Uriah is going to die. And he writes the message, and he seals it, and he sends it to Joab with Uriah. Yeah, not a good move. So Uriah literally delivers his death sentence to Joab. And it works out just the way David planned it. And Uriah dies, and the message comes back that he's dead. And in verse 26, we read this. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. She did not want to be a part of this. She was an unwilling participant. This is not how she wanted her life to go. This was not what she and Uriah had planned. Now Uriah is dead, and she has the shame of knowing what happened and that she is carrying another man's child. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. See, one of the things that will happen is that if we do not understand that our souls can never fully and be finally satisfied except in Jesus, we will find other ways to satisfy our souls. And in so doing, we will bring about pain on our families and on our lives and in our community as we seek to satisfy that longing, satisfy that desire with something that at best will only satisfy it temporarily. So what happened? Well, next, Nathan the prophet came to see David. I don't know whether Nathan figured it out, whether God told Nathan what happened, but Nathan knew exactly what happened. And he came to see King David, because he said, there's a situation, there's a case in the city you need to hear about because we need your judgment on this case. And here's what he says in 2 Samuel 12, verse 1 through 3. There were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and hands, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And then Nathan goes on and tells a story about how the rich man had a guest that came to his house. And because the rich man needed to feed the guest and didn't want to kill any of his own herd, he went and took the lamb from this poor man, his poor neighbor, had that lamb slaughtered and fed his neighbor, and the poor man was left with nothing. Well, when David heard this, he was absolutely incensed. He was furious. And here's what he said in verse 5 and 6 of 2 Samuel 12. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Boy, it's awfully easy to see it in other people, isn't it? It's awfully easy to see it in other people, maybe not so easy to see it in the mirror. But that's exactly where David was in this moment. And listen to what Nathan did next. Nathan said to David, "You are the man. You are that man." And suddenly the veil was lifted and the spotlight came on, and David could see himself in the mirror for who he really was. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been so consumed with the longing and the hunger and the lust and the desire that there came a moment when suddenly your eyes were opened and you realized? Where suddenly you realize what you'd become, what you'd done, who you'd hurt? Because as you're just satisfying the longing, satisfying the hunger, moment by moment, minute by minute, you're not thinking about it, but then something happens in your life and a spotlight shines on you. And you can see in an instant clearly exactly what your longings and lusts and desires have driven you to. Maybe it was an addiction to alcohol or addiction to pornography, but you suddenly realize, I am confronted with the truth of who I am and what I've become because I am trying to satisfy my soul with something that was never intended to fully and finally satisfy my soul. That was David in this moment. You are the man. Thus says the Lord. Now he's speaking for God, and he says this, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul, and I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arm, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this had been too little, I would have added you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? God is saying, David, I gave you everything. There was nothing I was withholding from you. And even if you had wanted more, if you had asked me, I'd have given you more. But you have despised me. You see, here's what happens. If we try to satisfy our souls with anything that we're not meant to satisfy our souls, we end up despising God. Because in essence, we're saying, God, you're not enough. This is enough. Power is enough. Money is enough. Possessions is enough. Sex is enough. Whatever it is, this is enough. I can't find satisfaction in you, so I'll find it in something else, and we end up despising the Lord in the process. You have despised the word of the Lord. Now, in this week's scripture reading, if you follow along in your worship guide, the reading, you'll follow this story, you'll read this story, and you'll read what happened next, because the consequences for this sin continued to multiply themselves throughout David's life and through the course of his family, as does the consequences of our choices when we try to satisfy our souls with something that was never meant to fully and finally satisfy them. So I want to share with you 3 things that a soul that is not satisfied in God will do. At least 3 things from this passage that a soul that is not satisfied with God will do. First of all, a soul that is not satisfied with God will become restless. It will become restless. In the spring when the kings go off to war, David was not where he was supposed to be. Why? He was restless. What was he doing? Look what it says in verse 2. As it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and went walking on the roof of the king's house. Why was he up there pacing and walking? He was looking for something. His soul was restless. You ever been there? Sure you have. We've all been there. Like, there's just this sense of boredom. It's not that you don't have things to do. It's just you don't want to do those things. You know what I'm talking about? Yes, you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Like, there's just this underlying sense inside of you of restlessness. It's not that there's not enough to keep you busy. It's that there's nothing you're doing or have to do that is going to satisfy your soul. So you're looking for something. You're itching for something, but you don't even know what itches. You're trying to find something inside of you. That's exactly what David was doing. And what happened? When he was walking on the roof, he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful, and David sent and inquired about the woman. Here's what is true about a soul that is not satisfied with God. It will become restless. And a restless heart will lead to a wandering eye, and a wandering eye will lead to a lingering stare, and a lingering stare will lead to a willful plan to sin. Every single time. Now, it might not be sex, it might be power, it might be money, it might be whatever you think it is, but you fill in the blank. A restless soul will lead you to a wandering eye. The wandering eye will lead to a lingering stare, will lead to a willful plan to sin. Why do I say a willful plan to sin? Because unlike all the famous people, Hollywood, the athletes, the politicians that you hear about who have, private scandals in their private lives, and they always say it was a mistake, this is no mistake. If you plan for it, it's not a mistake. There's another name for that, and that name is sin. If you have to plan to do it, then you are making a willful plan to sin, and that is exactly what David did. His heart was restless. That led him to go up and wander. He had a wandering eye. He saw Bathsheba. He had a lingering stare, and then he developed a plan to take Bathsheba and make her his own. Be aware of restless hearts. Be aware when your soul is restless. This is why the psalmist says, "Why are you so restless within me, O my soul?" You should ask your soul that question next time you're feeling that underlying sense of restlessness. Why are you so restless, soul? And stop. And reflect and see, why is your soul so restless in this moment? Maybe God's drawing you to himself. Maybe God's trying to draw you to him, but you're trying to find other things to satisfy it. You need to know when to halt. Know when to halt. We get this from our friends in the recovery movement. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Know when to halt. If you are any of those four things, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you will find yourself vulnerable to being restless and to falling into temptation, and to willfully planning to sin against God. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. A soul that is not satisfied in God will become restless, but a soul that is not satisfied in God also will use and abuse other people. We already mentioned this. David used Bathsheba, and he actually killed her husband to complete his plan. When Nathan came to David, he had this perfect story, and I don't know whether it was based in fact or whether it was a parable that he was making up, but this story of the rich man and the poor man and the lamb. Jesus told a similar parable. Jesus told a parable about a rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man had everything in this life he wanted, and the poor man, Lazarus, had nothing, and he was begging at the rich man's doorpost. And then in the next life, Lazarus was taken to Abraham's bosom, and the rich man was in hell. And the parable goes on to say that the rich man tells God, "Hey, send Lazarus to bring some water down to cool my lips. Tell Lazarus to go and warn my brothers about what's coming if they don't get their act together." In other words, the rich man was still trying to use Lazarus even after death. When your soul is not satisfied in God, you will use and abuse other people. In fact, there are many of you here today, a few of you I know your stories, many of you I probably don't know your stories, who you have been used and abused by someone who is simply trying to satisfy themselves for a moment. They just wanted a little more money. They just wanted your position in the organization. They just wanted one night of pleasure and satisfaction, and you thought it meant more. And they used you, and they abused you, and they tossed you aside. Because they were trying to satisfy something that was never going to be satisfied by what you had to offer. But as tragic as that is, equally as tragic is the fact that we have also been people who, because our souls were hungry and longing for something, have used and abused other people in the process. Because if your soul is not satisfied in God, you will inevitably use and abuse other people to get what you think will bring satisfaction to you. A soul that is not satisfied in God will become restless. It will use and abuse others. And finally, it will develop an insatiable appetite for more. An insatiable appetite for more. Listen to what God said through the prophet Nathan, verse 7. I anointed you king. I delivered you out from Saul's hands. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives. I gave you the entire nation of Israel and Judah. And if this had been too little, I would add you as much more. There was nothing that David could have acquired that would have brought satisfaction for his soul. His son later would write the book of Ecclesiastes. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, talks about all the things that he thought he was going to find to bring satisfaction. Wealth, money, power, fame, sex, pleasure. All the things he thought could do it. And he said at the end, it was all like a mist, like a vapor in the wind. It was here today and it was gone tomorrow because nothing was going to bring satisfaction. And the more you feed yourself with things that were never meant to satisfy you, the more insatiable your appetite will become. So what we need to do, and this is so easy to say and so difficult to do, stop trying to satisfy your soul with temporary things. All right, let's go home. All right, you got it? I got it? We're going to stop trying to satisfy our soul with temporary things. Problem solved, right? No, not at all. Not at all, because it's so much more difficult than that. I'm reminded what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount when he was talking to his disciples. And he gave a list, what we call the Beatitudes. And he said, blessed are those who are poor. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst now. For you will be satisfied. You know what that means? That means the fact that there are longings and desires that you have right now, they're not bad. They're given to you by God. The only problem is if you think somehow you can satisfy that here, fully, finally, here, now, that's when it's a problem. He said, blessed are you if you are hungering and thirsting and mourning. If you're poor now, blessed are you because you will be satisfied. But the reverse is also true. Hence the story of the rich man and Lazarus. If you are satisfied in all the temporary things of this world, you will never be satisfied in the eternal things of God. See, your desire for satisfaction through food, through sex, through beauty, through power, through wealth, is only evidence of a deeper longing inside your soul. And God gave you those things, and he gave you things to satisfy them temporarily for the purpose of pointing you past those things to himself. They may not be wrong in and of themselves, but they are only broken signposts pointing you past themselves to the real thing. What do I mean by that? What is a broken signpost? Well, it's broken because we keep trying to satisfy ourselves with the sign itself as opposed of looking to where the sign is pointing to. So if I leave church today and I'm hungry and I'm driving down the road and I stop at the sign that says Cracker Barrel, my hunger will never be satisfied by the sign that says Cracker Barrel. I am supposed to follow the sign to go to Cracker Barrel, where I will eat too much and be satisfied for a few minutes, only to be hungry again, right? Well, all these desires and these longings that you have are broken signposts. They're broken because we are fallen people. We're all sinful people. We've all fallen short of God's glory. We don't get it right. But they are signposts given by God to point us past those things to the real thing. God is not holding out on you. He only wants to point you to something better, something eternal that is found only in him. And that's why the only way you're going to stop trying to satisfy your soul with temporary things is to invite Jesus to fill the God-sized hole that's in your soul. It's the only way you'll do it. Is by inviting Jesus to fill the God-sized hole that is inside of you. Every single one of us. And this isn't just a one-time, I pray to receive Christ, I get baptized, and I got my certificate, right? It's not that. It is the need to abide, like we said last week, to abide every day in Christ to let every longing and desire point you back to him. All the beauty that we enjoy in this world does not compare to the beauties and glories that he has in store for us. So we accept the gift of the sign without making it an idol that we worship, instead allowing it to point us to Jesus, who is the only one who will fill the God-sized hole in our soul. I love a prayer that the Apostle Paul prayed for the church at Ephesus. And as he's praying for these believers, here's what he said. He prayed that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love. What does that mean? What does it mean to be rooted? Well, if you plant a tree and the roots go deep, they draw what they need from deep down. That's what he's praying. I'm praying that your roots will grow deep and that you'll draw what you need from a different source. Rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, here it comes, that surpasses beauty, that surpasses wisdom, that surpasses knowledge, that surpasses power, that surpasses sex, that surpasses wealth, that surpasses anything in this world. You can fill that blank in that says knowledge. You can fill it in with anything. It surpasses all of those things. It surpasses knowledge, that you may be, and here it comes, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. That you may be filled with all the fullness of God. See, your soul needs satisfaction. But temporary satisfaction will never be enough. And a soul that is not satisfied in God will be a restless soul. It will be a soul that seeks to abuse and use other people. And it will be a soul that has an insatiable hunger for more. Or you can trust that Jesus is enough. That Jesus is the ultimate satisfaction for your soul. And you can rely on him not just one time for your eternal salvation, but every day to fill you to the fullness of God.